They say that legends never die, and this is true. However, this doesn't apply to the people behind those legends. Everyone has their date with the Reaper eventually, and in the Old West, you never knew when that date would be. While some people lived longer lives, others ended up having their lives snuffed out abruptly from unexpected circumstances. Some frontier legends met their end in a blaze of glory and bullets. However, like any real person, some met their death anticlimactic. Old age, disease, heart attacks, and even falling off one's horse could be ways a person met their end in the Old West. With the lack of modern medical care, even the smallest of wounds could spell death for people. And in some cases, the people who did die were over-exaggerated, touted as some epic hero when the truth's much blander than fiction. In this video, we'll ride with those legends into the sunset and explore their final days. And remember, memento mori. Also, remember to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications for the latest videos. Wyatt Earp, a quiet death for a loud man. We all know the legend of Wyatt Earp. He is the epitome of a sheriff bringing law and order to the West. That said, if you have watched our previous video on the OK Corral shooting, you know that the true man behind the legend was a lot different. He was not a flawless representation of a moral character, but a very flawed man. He engaged in many heinous acts, including opening a brothel where some say he might have been a pimp. Even during his time with the Wichita police, he met with many altercations from a political standpoint, but in other ways. He moved in between towns, eventually settling in Tombstone with his brothers Virgil and James, where of course the OK Corral shooting occurred. Even before the shooting, Earp was always getting into trouble, including facing down a lynch mob, supposedly single-handedly dispersing all of them. At one point, he was even charged with murder by Ike Clandon during the OK Corral shooting, but there was nowhere near enough evidence to hold him, so both he and his brothers were eventually off the hook. Yes, the man seemed to not know how to sit still and was a magnet for trouble. So how did Earp meet his maker? It wasn't from a final battle with an outlaw gang where he killed them all but succumbed to his wounds. Instead, Earp lived to the respectable age of 80. He had outlived his brother, Virgil, who died from pneumonia at the much younger age of 62. His brother Newton passed away at 91 a month prior. He was also the last of the surviving members of the OK Corral shooting to pass away, which is a sort of bragging rights for a guy like that. As an elderly man, Wyatt spent his last days in a rented bungalow in Los Angeles. While his slicked hair had mostly receded and lines covered his face, he still had the rugged cowboy look and the mustache until the very end. So, what did Wyatt in? For the past 3 years, he had been suffering from liver disease. Ironically, Wyatt himself was not a man who drank in saloons often, but instead preferred ice cream. However, the liver disease did not do him in. What did him in was chronic cystitis, better known as a urinary tract infection of the bladder. He succumbed to it on January 13, 1929. Nowadays, UTIs are easily treatable through antibiotics, but back then they could be a death sentence, especially if you were elderly. Wyatt left behind no kids despite having 4 wives in his lifetime. He was cremated, with Grace Spoladora and Alma, daughter and daughter-in-law of his friend, Charlie Welsh, being witnesses. Even then, his death has legends surrounding it. One legend is that his wife, Josephine, heard his last words, which were, "Suppose, suppose," with the man passing before he could complete a mysterious final thought. Despite his quiet death, he had a loud funeral. Hollywood celebrities helped to fund it, including an early Western star, Tom Mix, and William S. Hart. Eventually, his ashes were buried beside Josephine's in the Jewish Hills of Eternity Cemetery, as Josephine was Jewish. While Wyatt, despite his flaws, lived a legendary life, his death was something that many desire, to live to a decent age and spend their last years peacefully. Wyatt did have to deal with the struggles of getting old, but his death was one where he spent his last days with his wife and was then celebrated by many people, including celebrities. However, the next death we'll discuss was not peaceful. Jesse James, killed by a coward. Here's a legend whose death was so rage-inducing that people refused to believe it. We're talking about legendary outlaw Jesse James. So, for those who don't know, Jesse James was a man with a reputation, not the most favorable, of course. He was an outlaw, bank robber, Cruella, gang leader, and a man with strong Southern sympathies, a legend in his own rights. The man was even a part of the bushwhackers up in Missouri and Kansas during the Civil War, eventually being accused of many atrocities during the Civil War, especially towards abolitionists and the Union soldiers. He is also cited to have been a part of the Centralia Massacre in the Civil War. But what would lead to his death was not the altercations he had with soldiers or how he approached deaths with Union soldiers. It was what he did after that played a part. The James Younger gang, led by Jesse James, his brother Frank, and Cole Younger, terrorized people during the 19th century. They robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches all throughout the Midwest, leading to national fame and notoriety because of how brutal the crimes were. However, by the early 1880s, law enforcement had nearly wiped out his gang. Their attempted robbery in Northfield, Minnesota, was the beginning of the gang's downfall, as many members were killed and captured, and pressure only increased as more and more gang members were taken away. But Jesse was not going to let the law get him. He planned a heist with two brother gang members, Charles and Robert Ford. Robert, or Bob, was new to the gang, but little did Jesse know that he was a double-crosser. He had been working with Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden to bring in the outlaw. However, James became immediately suspicious of the Fords after one of his gang members, Dick Little, confessed to murdering Wood Height, a cousin of the James brothers. He saw this in the news while eating breakfast. Why didn't the Ford brothers tell James about this? It turned out that Little wasn't the only one involved in the death of Height. Ford was also involved in a gunfight gone terribly wrong. And when Ford had to face justice for the death of Height, he struck a deal with Governor Crittenden to bring him Jesse James, dead or alive, and his crimes would be pardoned. The Fords knew that Jesse James knew, but instead of taking them out, Jesse made a fatal mistake, turning his back. After eating breakfast, he laid his revolvers on a sofa and started to clean a dusty picture above the mantel. Robert grabbed the revolver and everything went black for Jesse. A legendary outlaw was taken out at just 34 years old, not in a blaze of glory, but by betrayal and a fatal mistake. The governor kept true to his word, pardoning the Fords after claiming they'd be sentenced to hanging. However, in the frontier, snitches didn't just get stitches. James's betrayal sparked outrage from other outlaws and even from the public, who saw him as a sort of Robin Hood-esque figure. And one person, Edward O'Kelly, decided to take action. Kelly entered the tent saloon of Robert, said, "Hello, Bob," and shot him in the neck as his back was turned. Robert was just 30 years old, a truly satisfying revenge story if we say so ourselves. As for Charles, his own guilt, along with a morphine addiction, got to him, and at only 26 years old, he took his own life. For the Fords, it was a lesson that even if you are promised better things, betraying your companions should never be the last resort. In the end, it only comes back to bite you, or your guilt takes you away. Also, there are many conspiracies and folklore surrounding James. In a way, Jesse James was the Tupac of the 19th century, with some of his fans believing that there was no way such a man could be taken out like that, and that he had survived and gone into hiding, even leaving behind a massive treasure to those who were lucky enough to find it. However, this has been proven to be false. In 1995, over a century after his death, DNA evidence proved that the body in the grave was in fact Jesse's. And that grave still stands, with the message that James was murdered by a traitor and a coward whose name is not worthy to appear on the tombstone. Still, that doesn't stop many tales of Jesse James's continuing adventures. While these stories can be engaging and a fun look into alternative history, they are just that. Fictional stories, even if, in some cases, they seem just as shocking as the real thing. Now let's look at a common way that people died in the Old West: consumption. Tuberculosis, the killer of legends. Even if you're a casual frontier observer, you probably know Doc Holliday, a legendary gunfighter who was a friend of Wyatt Earp. The man was known as a dentist, gambler, and gunfighter, also best known for his participation in the OK Corral gunfight. But even after the fight, his reputation for killing many men grew, with over a dozen cited to have died through different altercations. However, the truth behind these exaggerated numbers is that he only killed about 3 men at most. He lived a colorful life, like many from the OK Corral and Jesse James. Also like Jesse James, Doc Holliday died at the young age of 36. However, what killed him wasn't a gunfight or even betrayal, but a common disease that took many lives in the Old West, tuberculosis. Like Wyatt with his UTI, tuberculosis is an infection that is treatable with a round of antibiotics nowadays. But in the frontier times, it was a deadly, infectious disease that would kill 1 in 7. This infectious disease was caused by a bacteria that infected the lungs and spread through the air. The symptoms usually involved long-lasting coughing, chest pain, and coughing up blood. And again, while these days, modern medicine has solutions for treating TB, the moment it shows in the frontier days, it was known as a death sentence. It didn't matter how young you were, it would not only kill you, but it would eat away at your body. It was known as consumption during this time because of that. It was a disease that, in many different tales of the frontier, you hear about the horrors one experienced when faced with such a dreadful disease. Doc Holliday's mother, whom he lost when he was just 15, and his sister were taken by consumption, and Doc himself contracted it shortly after starting his dental practice, which he could not keep up due to the disease. Going to the dentist is scary enough, but imagine if your dentist had tuberculosis. Many would rather choose the cavity. Doc was only in his 20s when he got consumption, so throughout the next decade, including the OK Corral gunfight, he laid down the law while fighting a battle inside, and while Doc put up a good fight, consumption soon got him. In his last years, he lived in Colorado and turned to drink and opium to deal with the symptoms. Doc knew his time was running out. Here is a photo discovered in 2015 of an unknown man that many believe to be Doc in his last years. While it hasn't been proven to be Doc, it hasn't been disproven either. And even if it's not Doc, it perfectly matches how he was during this time, gaunt, graying prematurely, and desperate. If anything were touted as a cure for tuberculosis, Doc would take it, no questions asked. One cure that people believed would help with tuberculosis was the hot springs of Glenwood Springs. Hot springs can have many health benefits, but for tuberculosis, the drawbacks, especially in sulfur springs, far outweigh the benefits. The sulfurous fumes can irritate the lungs further, and soon he was at death's door. Holliday spent his last days surrounded not by outlaws, but by nurses. He believed that he would die with his boots on, and as he lay there, his feet without boots, he looked at death not with scorn or panic, but with amusement. He said, "This is funny." Then he went to the other side. Doc could not beat consumption, which almost seemed like a family curse, but he fought hard. Now, let's look at another death caused by a now treatable disease and a death due to a less treatable one, a broken heart. Death and death by a broken heart. We have talked a lot about Annie Oakley, a legendary sharpshooter who helped turn the Wild West into a spectacle. Her skills as a hunter helped feed her impoverished family in Ohio, and at 15 would soon go on to engage in sharpshooting contests where she went up against Frank Butler and later joined Buffalo Bill. Her tale was also romantic, with her marrying her shooting companion Frank Butler. But how did she die in a stunt gone too far? Did she misshoot a cigar out of her husband's hand, or did the recoil from splitting a playing card come back to her? Nope. Even in her later years of age in a car crash, she wasn't shutting you down. In her 60s, she was still shooting, supporting women's rights, and even cited after World War I broke out that she could have shot the Kaiser and might have saved millions of soldiers. If this old lady were telling you to get off her lawn, you better listen. However, in 1926, Death took her at the age of 66. While she didn't die young, she also died much too soon. So, what killed her? After effects of her car accident that forced her to wear a steel brace and took over a year to recover? It is yet another disease that is easily treatable nowadays. Pernicious anemia is a disease where the blood cell count is low due to a lack of vitamin B12. The treatment is injecting vitamin B12 into a patient. However, vitamin B12 will not be isolated for another 2 decades. While this was a tragic death, the death of Frank Butler was even more tragic. Butler grieved her death, stopped eating, and died just 18 days after her death. Annie was cremated, and Frank was buried next to her ashes, with one rumor claiming that her ashes were in a trophy buried with Butler. Now, let's go back to outlaws and those who betray them by talking about another legend. Short life, long claims. Most of us know of Billy the Kid. He was an infamous outlaw who lived by the gun and died by the gun at only 21 years old. And like Jesse James, it's a story of betrayal and conspiracy. The guy had 9 murders under his belt at the time of his passing, 4 of which he was completely responsible for. After being orphaned at 15, he quickly turned to a life of crime, stealing food, robbing a Chinese laundry, and, of course, snowballing into inevitable murder. Which crime was it that did him in then? In his last stand, Billy the Kid was on the run from the law. Governor Lew Wallace put a $500 bounty on anyone who could capture him, which is over $15,000 in today's money, a nice chunk of change for the guy's head. There were many hunters on his head for the money, including lawman Pat Garrett. Garrett and Billy were friends, with Billy even attending Garrett's wedding at one point. However, the law was the law, and a bounty was a bounty. Pat Garrett was at the home of Pete Maxwell, a resident of Fort Sumner, at his house, and a friend of Billy. Billy entered the bedroom when the two were talking, and the story goes that Billy, due to the poor lighting, could not see who it was. Billy asked, "Quién es?" Spanish for "Who is it?" The voice was the only confirmation Garrett needed to shoot first and ask questions later. Garrett was rewarded handsomely. At first, the acting governor of New Mexico, William G. Rich, refused to pay. However, Garrett eventually got his reward a year later. Also, in what would be a GoFundMe story today, New Mexican citizens raised over $7,000, or over $219,000 for him. But just like Jesse James, many believe that this wasn't the end of his story. Legend has it that Garrett didn't gun down Billy, but Garrett helped fake his death, and Billy got away with it. It didn't help that many men over the years claimed they were Billy the Kid. One example is Brushy Bill Roberts. Thomas Mabry, governor of New Mexico, didn't believe him. Another case was John Miller. This claim is unresolved to this day. In 2005, Miller's remains were examined and compared to blood samples found on the floorboards of the old Lincoln County courthouse that allegedly belonged to Billy, along with blood on a bench. The results were described as useless. Several other men have claimed to be Billy, and this went on until it would be impossible for him to be still alive. It shows that people will do anything for attention, but with some circumstances of death being as dark as the room he died in, it makes people's imaginations go wild. While we idolize the lawmen, we also idolize the ones who defy the law. There is always a part of us who likes to see the outlaw get away in the end. And the same can be said for Billy's story. For many, his story ended too abruptly, too soon. But could he have faked his death and lived a much longer life? No one knows for sure, and that's the fun of it. But what about Billy's killer? What happened to him? It is also worth telling. Who axed Pat? Finally, let's talk about Billy's killer, allegedly, if you believe the conspiracies, Pat Garrett, because he had a mysterious death, too. Before he took out Billy the Kid, Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett was a lawman, bartender, and a customs agent, even spending a little bit of time as the sheriff of Donna Ana County and Lincoln County in New Mexico. Prior to his pursuit of Billy the Kid, the man lived a pretty normal life. And the death wasn't centered around robbery or government conspiracy. Instead, it involved goats. Pat Garrett was not gunned down by a supporter of Billy's and lived a much longer life. He died in 1908 at 57, an age that's not young but much too soon to go. So, what took him out? It wasn't a disease, but a bullet, and no one knows for sure who shot him. It began with a land dispute. The son of Pat, Dudley Poor Garrett, signed a lease with Jesse Wayne Brazel, a ranch hand. The lease was for Brazel's Bear Canyon Ranch. However, this deal would soon turn sour. The Garretts were cattlemen, while Brazel was bringing in herds of goats to the farm. But the goats weren't the only issue. There was also a neighborly dispute. Garrett's neighbor, W. Bill Cox, was funding this goat herd. Not only that, but another man, Archie Print Road, was a partner to Brazel in this herd. This dispute got so bad that an outlaw, James B. Miller, better known as Killin' Jim, got involved. Garrett sent Miller to Brazel, and Brazel agreed to cancel the lease. Problem solved, right? Well, Brazel had one stipulation. Someone had to buy all of the goats. How many were there? 1,200 factorial. Luckily, an in-law of Miller, Carl Adamson, agreed to buy them, but then Brazel told Adamson he miscounted. There were 1,800. That was 600 goats, too many for Adamson. But Garrett and Adamson planned on meeting Brazel to resolve this issue in some way. As Garrett and Adamson went by wagon, they saw someone approaching on horseback. It was Brazel. Then Garrett was lying there, dead. Brazel admitted to killing Garrett, even allegedly shouting to Deputy Sheriff Felipe Lucero, "Lock me up, I've just killed Pat Garrett." Case closed, right? Well, Adamson, the only witness, didn't show up to the trial, and Brazel was acquitted. And to this day, while the official story says that Brazel killed Garrett, there have been alternative theories. Did Adamson shoot him to get out of buying all of these goats? What about Cox, the man who funded all of these goats? One historian, Leon C. Metz, believed that Cox might have done it, but there's a possibility that Adamson could have as well. Another suggestion is that Print Road, the other partner to Brazel, did it. Or could it be Killin' Jim, bringing in justice for Billy the Kid? It goes to show that a legend can die in such a silly dispute over goats. However, they can die so mysteriously that their deaths are talked about to this day. The deaths of some of the Old West legends are a little different from what you'd assume. Sometimes they ended in tragedy, while other times it was natural disease or old age. Wyatt Earp did not die in a shootout with lawmen, but of a urinary tract infection. Jesse James did not die in a blaze of glory, but he was shot in the head by someone who claimed to be their partner. Doc Holliday did not die chasing a criminal, but died from consumption and too many sulfur fumes from the Colorado hot springs. Annie Oakley and her husband Frank did not die from a crazy stunt, but from a lack of vitamin B12 and a broken heart. Billy the Kid, from what we know, did not die of old age, but entered eternal darkness in a room that was almost as dark. And finally, Billy's killer, Pat Garrett, died over a goat dispute, and people aren't so sure who did him in. In many Old West tales, the deaths are often satisfying. A hero dies in a shootout or lives to fight another day. An outlaw gets his comeuppance by the long arm of the law, but he will fight till the bitter end in a climactic final stand. But in reality, it could have been a now preventable disease, a dispute over land, or a sudden betrayal that does someone in. And in the case of betrayal, there's no rise from the ashes for the betrayed, but death. It also goes to show that even if you lived the most nefarious life or the life of a lawman bent on delivering justice, the Grim Reaper is always there, ready to strike, and it could be from the simplest matters. If you enjoyed hearing about how the legends of the frontier ended, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. If this video does well enough, we may do a part 2. There are many other legends of the Old West, and many other deaths to talk about. Take care, and may you have a long life.